Something is wrong here. Do any actual remains still exist? You would think that should have a clear answer. Either they do, or they do not. Something like that should not leave much room. It should be settled. It should be easy to point to. Easy to say yes, easy to say no. And at first that feels like enough. If anything real is still there, then there should be something solid beneath all of this. Something that stays in place. Something that does not change depending on who is speaking. But that is where it starts to feel unsteady. Because the closer you get to that simple answer, the less fixed it seems. What should be direct begins to feel oddly thin. Not absent. Not present in any clean way either. Just not where you expect it to be. You keep waiting for one clear thing to hold. And somehow, it never quite does. So do any actual remains still exist? The first obstacle is almost disappointingly plain. In a museum drawer, rows of baked bricks lie side by side, each one the right general material, each one ancient enough to belong somewhere in Mesopotamia, and beside them the tags remain blank where a decisive identity would have to begin. Genesis gives building materials, not inventory numbers. Baked brick, bitumen, a city, a tower. That sounds concrete until the drawer is opened. Baked brick was not rare. Bitumen was not rare. Nothing in the surviving labels, ancient or modern, says this brick came from Babel. That absence seems to settle the matter. If no object was marked as such in antiquity, then no distinct set of Babel bricks survives. The physical world appears to agree. Under a pale sky, an eroded ziggurat wall shows what Mesopotamian construction usually looked like. A thick body of mud brick, with only a thinner skin of fired brick, still clinging to the outside. In a foundation trench nearby, a black seam of bitumen still runs between cracked courses. The biblical description fits the region well enough to stop being diagnostic. It names a method, not a monument. For a moment, that feels sufficient. The question, do any actual remains still exist, seems answerable with a careful no. Not as identifiable relics, not as a recoverable set. Then the wall itself complicates that answer. Fired bricks survive where mud brick does not. Outer courses endure after cores slump, after upper stages dissolve, after names are forgotten. If a tower once stood anywhere in this building tradition, its most durable parts would look exactly like these surviving bands and seams. The problem is no longer survival. It is recognition. That distinction sharpens in the trench. The bitumen line is still black, still adhesive in places after centuries of burial pressure and heat. Genesis mentions bitumen specifically, and here it is behaving exactly as the text would lead one to expect. Not metaphor, not embellishment, but construction practice. So perhaps the remains do exist after all, dispersed among ordinary-looking ruins, hidden by their own normality. But the more closely the materials fit, the less they isolate anything. Bitumen joins many foundations. Fired-facing bricks appear on many towers. Mud brick cores decay, in much the same way from site to site. A surviving outer brick tells you that a monumental structure once needed weather resistance. It does not tell you which story later attached itself to that structure. Even the best preserved examples preserve the least distinctive part, the durable exterior, not the original whole. And there is another difficulty in the drawer. The bricks are plain. No ancient inscription names Babel. No dedicatory formula ties one surviving unit to the episode imagined in the story. If a brick bears nothing, it cannot identify itself. If it bears a royal stamp from a later king, it belongs immediately to another chronology. Those stamped examples are set aside for now, but their very existence waits at the edge of the question. If the only bricks that can be securely placed are later ones, what exactly is surviving from the earlier horizon people want? So the investigation pauses in an awkward but productive place. Actual remains of the right materials plainly survive. Ruined tower fabric survives. Bitumen survives. Fired bricks survive. What does not survive, at least not yet, is a boundary around them narrow enough to say, these, and not the thousands beside them, are the bricks of Babel. The first obstacle is almost too simple. If bricks from Babel survived, where would they be expected to survive? Not in a legend, but in a ruin. and Babylon is a ruin made of brick on a scale large enough to keep that question alive. Across the plain, the mounds still carry broken lines of masonry through the dust. Not a scatter of chance debris, but the remains of walls, platforms, and foundations measured in long straight runs. A place built so heavily in brick makes survival feel less like fantasy and more like inventory. That impression sharpens at the ziggurat site. The ground there does not rise as a vague hill. It opens into a deep rectangular ruin, a footprint large enough to hold the memory of a tower even after the tower itself has gone. Scattered fired bricks still lie around the edges. Later writers connected Babylon's great tower with Babel, and here at least there is an actual tower site in the right city, with actual bricks still present. For a moment, the question seems to narrow cleanly. Perhaps the remains do exist, simply under another name. The storage yards make that seem even more concrete. Stacks of Babylonian bricks survive in quantity, many of them stamped, each face pressed with Nebuchadnezzar's cuneiform inscription. Not dozens. Millions were made in his reign, and enough remain that the repetition becomes its own argument. If a monumental tower stood here and was rebuilt here, then surviving bricks from that tower should not be rare. They should be ordinary. The problem would not be survival, only identification. Then the mortar starts to matter. In exposed brickwork, dark bitumen still glistens in the joints under direct sun. That detail reaches backward unexpectedly, because the biblical description of the tower builders uses baked brick and bitumen, and Babylonian construction does in fact show both. The materials fit. The city fits. The tower site fits. The ruins seem to answer the question physically before they answer it historically, but the fit is almost too smooth. The stamped bricks in storage are not anonymous building blocks from some unreachable beginning. They speak in the name of a king whose works are widely distributed across Babylon. The same inscription appears on bricks from walls, gates, temples, and platforms. A stamped brick proves Babylonian construction, even royal construction. But what does it prove about one specific tower? If these bricks are everywhere, then abundance helps survival, while making attribution less secure. The ziggurat site itself keeps the pressure on that point. Fired bricks lie around its edges, yet the central area remains a broken depression rather than a preserved stack. What survives visibly is not a standing sequence from foundation to summit, but a disturbed field of later exposure, collapse, and removal. The place makes tower material plausible. It does not sort one building phase from another in plain sight, so the question tightens rather than closes. Actual remains still exist. Brick ruins, stamped bricks, bitumen-bonded masonry, a tower footprint in Babylon itself. That much the ground will give. But if these are the surviving materials later generations pointed to when they said, Babel, what in the ruin would distinguish tower brick from city brick, or one rebuilding from the structure that first fixed itself in memory? The first thing that looks promising is how ordinary it is. In a museum case, a fired Babylonian brick stands upright under a plain label. Babylon. Its face carries a royal stamp in cuneiform, pressed deep enough to survive chipping at the edges. Nearby, a tray holds more of them in sequence, the same inscription repeated again and again. If the question is whether any actual remains still exist, this seems close to a clean answer. The biblical account speaks of baked bricks and bitumen. Here are baked bricks from Babylon in large numbers, not imagined, not reconstructed, but excavated. The case becomes harder to ignore because of what hangs behind it. A reconstruction drawing of Etemenanke, the great tower later writers connected with Babel. A real monumental tower stood in Babylon. Later Jewish and classical traditions pointed to Babylon's great tower when they spoke of Babel. The materials match. The city matches. The scale matches. It begins to feel less like a legend floating free of place, and more like a story attached to a known ruin. Then the site plan intrudes. At the ziggurat precinct, the low brick platforms and boundary walls still read clearly across the ground. But the central tower area remains broken and uneven. The surviving bricks are abundant. The surviving tower body is not. The neat certainty offered by the museum case depends on a question the ruin does not answer by itself. Which of these bricks actually came from the tower, and which came from everything built around it? Some do come from the precinct. That helps. For a while. Fired bricks from Babylon survive in such quantity that the existence of physical remains no longer seems doubtful. The issue narrows. Not whether anything survives, but whether these surviving pieces belong to the structure that fed the Babel tradition. The reconstruction drawing behind the case almost settles that too. Etemenanke was not a vague possibility. It was a specific monumental tower in the right city, remembered strongly enough that later generations identified it with Babel. If actual bricks from that precinct survive, then perhaps the remains are already in front of us, only under a more historical name. But the stamped faces create their own disturbance. They are too consistent, too legible, too numerous. Royal building programs produce repetition on that scale. A tray lined with identical stamped bricks suggests organized manufacture, rebuilding, restoration, state control. It answers one question: yes, Babylonian tower material survives, while opening another that sits awkwardly beside it. Are these the remains of a remembered tower, or the remains of a later campaign that covered, replaced, or absorbed whatever stood there before? The ruin itself offers no easy separation. The central area is broken, not preserved as a standing stack. The precinct contains walls, platforms, edges, and displaced material. A brick stamped by a Babylonian king can be undeniably ancient and undeniably from Babylon, yet still leave its exact placement unresolved. Was it set in the tower's outer fabric, in an adjoining structure, in a retaining wall, in a later repair? The label in the case does not say Babel. It says Babylon, which is both enough and not enough. So, actual remains do exist. Fired bricks from Babylon survive, and some are tied to the ziggurat precinct long associated with Babel. For a moment that seems to settle the matter. Then the repeated stamps, the broken tower core, and the spread of brickwork across the precinct leave the same pressure in place. Remains of what phase? What part? What rebuilding? What remembered tower? The question sounds simple enough to pin to a shelf label. Do any actual remains of Babel still exist? At first glance, the answer seems to be yes. In the ruined tower mounted Babylon, hard-fired brick fragments still sit above softer brown layers, and along some exposed edges the outer courses remain squared, while the interior has slumped into a crumbly mass. That looks like survival. A tower once stood here. Parts of its brick skin are still here now. The neatness of those surviving outer bricks makes the case feel stronger. Some are stamped. Neo-Babylonian royal inscriptions repeat across their faces in regular sequence, the kind of mass production expected for a monumental rebuilding. If later writers identified Babylon's great tower with Babel, and if bricks from that tower precinct survive, then perhaps the problem has been overstated. The remains exist. They are simply sitting in plain view as Babylonian tower bricks. But the section through the mound does not keep that answer still for long. The fired fragments occupy the upper and outer zones, where preservation is best. Beneath them, the older body of the structure appears as soft mud brick, water-cut, blurred, and difficult to separate into clean building episodes. Rain channels bite into the core and leave the outer facing more legible than the mass it once protected. The material that survives most clearly is the material most exposed to later rebuilding. The material most likely to belong to earlier phases is the material least able to hold its shape. That would still be manageable if the tower had been built once. The platform does not look like that. Brick courses change size and color. Straight runs are interrupted by patched sections. Some lines continue, then stop against repairs that belong to another campaign. The mound reads less like a single preserved object than like repeated attempts to keep one standing. Etemenanke, if this is the structure behind the tradition, was not one stack of bricks left untouched until excavation. It was restored, refaced, repaired, and probably rebuilt more than once. So perhaps the surviving remains are real enough, but only as later tower material. That explanation fits the preservation pattern almost too well. The best preserved bricks are the later facing bricks, especially the stamped Neo-Babylonian ones. While the earlier core has decayed into something harder to date and harder to isolate, If the question is whether tower bricks survive, yes. If the question is whether the surviving bricks belong to the earliest event imagined by the story, the exposed layers offer no clean path downward, and that is where the labels become slippery. A stamped brick from Babylon can be genuine, ancient, and from the tower precinct, yet still belong to a rebuilding centuries after the earliest biblical traditions took shape. A crumbling inner mass may be older, but its edges have washed, collapsed, and merged with later work. The remains are there in front of us. Outer courses, fired fragments, patched platforms, decayed chorus. What remains missing is not brick, but continuity. Which course belongs to which phase? Which phase, if any, belongs to the remembered tower? The mound keeps the material and withholds the sequence. The first answer seems almost too easy once the cases are lined up, side by side. On one museum wall, bricks from Babylon, Borsippa, Ur, and other ziggurat cities sit in adjacent compartments, each tagged by site, period, and trenching. Their surfaces are close enough to invite a shortcut. Baked clay, rectangular faces, traces of black mortar, the same practical geometry repeated across the plane. If the question is whether any actual remains still exist, then yes, remains exist everywhere. The shelf is crowded with them. That would settle it, except the labels do not converge. None says Babel. The trays do not narrow toward one tower. They multiply it. Across Mesopotamia, ruined step towers rise from separate sites under the same flat horizon. Their surviving terraces share the same construction logic. Mud brick mass inside, fired brick where exposure demanded it, bitumen where joints needed sealing. A black streak in one fragment from Babylon matches the seam on a piece from Borsippa, closely enough that material alone stops helping. The biblical description of brick and bitumen suddenly feels less like a fingerprint than a regional habit. If so many towers were built this way, what exactly would a Babel brick look like that another tower's brick would not? For a moment, the landscape itself offers a workable answer. Perhaps one ruin dominated memory so completely that later generations attach the story to it, and the surviving bricks from that place are the nearest thing available. But the plane does not cooperate. From a distance, multiple mound-like temple towers break the horizon in the same stair-step silhouette. Some are broader, some more eroded, some reduced to low platforms. Yet the family resemblance is stubborn. A story formed in the presence of one ruin could easily borrow scale from another, material from a third, and dread from all of them together. The storage shelf makes that harder to ignore. Bitumen-streaked fragments from different sites rest only inches apart, and the distinctions become administrative rather than visual. Accession number, excavation year, provenience. One tray preserves a corner with heavy vitrification from firing. Another holds a fragment with mortar, still adhering in a thick black band. Useful details, but useful for what? They can place a brick in a building tradition. They can sometimes place it in a city. They do not isolate a single remembered event. Then chronology begins to intrude from another direction. Akkadian and Sumerian records already speak of ambitious temple towers. Long before later, writers identified Babylon's Great Tower with Babel. The motif at the center of the biblical story, human speech breaking apart, does not point to a layer in a mound, a stamped course, or a foundation trenched. It points away from recoverable architecture. Yet the architecture remains in quantity across the region. So the question changes without disappearing. Not, do any bricks survive? They plainly do. Not even, do bricks survive from towers later called Babel? Some certainly do. The pressure gathers around a narrower problem visible in the cases themselves. When several cities preserve nearly indistinguishable tower bricks, and when the story does not specify a recoverable layer, what survives is no longer one stack waiting to be identified, but a field of candidates whose similarity is the obstacle. The remains are real. The singularity is what keeps slipping. The question sounds simple enough to fit on a label. Do any actual remains of the Tower of Babel still exist? In a museum storeroom, the answer almost seems to be yes. A shelf holds bricks from Babylon, Borsippa, and in orderly rows, each tagged with a site name, trench number, and excavation year. The tags are precise where the larger claim is not. Babylon. Borsipor. Never Babel. That absence first looks bureaucratic, rather than meaningful. Of course, a biblical name would not appear in an archaeological register. If later generations identified Babylon's Great Tower with Babel, then surviving bricks from that tower, precinct might be the nearest thing available. The problem would only be naming. That explanation holds for a while because the material fits. Fired bricks survive in quantity. Bitumen survives. Tower sites survive. Some fragments come from precincts long associated with the Babel tradition. A brick does not need to announce itself to belong to the right ruin. Then the shelf itself starts to interfere. The bricks from different cities are close enough in size, color, and fabric to invite comparison and resist it at the same time. Similar clay bodies. Similar firing. Similar black mortar traces. If one asks what a Babel brick should look like, the shelf offers too many answers at once. A site tag narrows provenance to a ruin, not to a story, and not even always to one structure within the ruin. The tower bases make that harder to ignore. At one ruined platform, stamped bricks sit sideways in later masonry. Their inscription is still legible, though their placement is wrong for an original course. Beside them, earlier mud brick has slumped into a brown friable mass. The reused stamped pieces seem promising at first. Real tower material, real Babylonian construction, real survival. But the wall shows them inserted into a later repair. A brick can belong to a tower site and still have arrived there after collapse, after rebuilding, after dismantling somewhere else on the same mound. If it was moved once, how many times? A fragment in a case sharpens the problem by being so modest. It carries only a site number and excavation year. No royal stamp. No dedicatory line. No architectural certainty beyond ziggurat precinct. That sounds frustratingly thin, until the alternative appears worse. The stamped bricks are often easier to date, and they tend to belong to major rebuilding phases. The anonymous fragment could be earlier, or it could be debris washed downslope from a later collapse. The label cannot decide between those possibilities, and the fragment's broken edges do not preserve enough context to decide for it. Out at the ruins, collapsed heaps of brick and bitumen seem at first to settle the matter physically. Here are the remains. Old bricks, fragments, black lumps of mortar, all in one layer at the foot of a tower mound. But the layer is exactly what keeps the question open. Collapse, mixes, courses. Repairs, introduce reused material. Erosion drags outer, facing bricks down over older cores. A heap can prove survival without preserving sequence. So actual remains do exist in storerooms, cases, and ruined foundations. Some come from towers later called Babel. Yet every surviving piece arrives with the same missing interval. No continuous chain from biblical episode to excavated brick. No intact layer that can be pointed to without the later rebuilds pressing in around it. The bricks are there. The name is later. The context in between is where the certainty should be, and where the ground keeps giving way. Do any actual remains still exist? From a distance, the tower site at Babylon answers too quickly. The ruin still dominates the plain, as a broad scar of brick and earth, large enough that later generations hardly needed help deciding what it was. A place on that scale invites a name. If the story of Babel attached itself anywhere, this is the kind of mound it would choose. That first impression gains weight in the materials. In a display case, fired bricks sit beside a lump of black bitumen. The pairing is awkwardly familiar. Baked brick, bitumen mortar, exactly the combination described in Genesis. The match feels almost too clean. If the question is whether anything physical survives from the kind of structure later remembered as Babel, these objects seem to settle it. Not a legend, not a vanished idea, but actual construction material, from monumental Mesopotamian towers. Then the ground starts withholding what the case appears to give. Broken outer bricks spill down the sides of the mound. Squared faces still visible, while the deeper layers remain sealed under packed soil. The surviving pieces are the ones most likely to endure exposure. Fired outer courses, harder, later, more transportable. What lies beneath them is less cooperative. Tower cores in Mesopotamia were often mud brick, and mud brick does not preserve like fired-facing brick. It softens, slumps, merges back into the mound. If the visible remains are mostly outer skin, what phase of the tower are they actually preserving? The foundation spreads the problem wider. Repeated brick courses run across the exposed base, but the lines are interrupted by gaps, collapses, and repairs. Some stretches look regular enough to suggest a single monumental plan. Others show patching, replacement, and uneven joins. A tower, rebuilt many times, would leave exactly this kind of surface. Not one event fixed in brick, but a long sequence of restorations layered into one footprint. That helps explain why the place remained charged for so long. A ruin repeatedly repaired and repeatedly broken keeps renewing its own memory. Yet chronology presses in where appearance seems most persuasive. The best preserved fired bricks from Babylon are often Neo-Babylonian, especially from the age of Nebuchadnezzar II, whose building program covered the city in stamped bricks. Those bricks are real. Some come from the ziggurat precinct. Some may well have belonged to the great tower later identified with Babel. But the biblical tradition is earlier than Nebuchadnezzar's rebuilding, and the tower itself had older phases beneath his work. The material that survives most clearly is not necessarily the material that first generated the story. So the remains do exist, but not in the form the question first expects. There is no secure stack that can be isolated as the original Babel fabric. There are surviving bricks from Babylonian tower ruins, surviving bitumen, surviving courses, surviving precinct debris. There is also repeated rebuilding, collapse, reuse, and the quiet disappearance of older mud brick into the mass below. The site is physically present and historically overfull at the same time. That leaves the most stubborn facts standing in the open. The ruins are substantial enough to have become Babel in cultural memory, and the materials fit the description closely enough to keep that identification alive. But when the visible bricks are mostly later survivors from a tower rebuilt over older towers, what exactly is being preserved here? A specific building from a specific episode, or the durable outer remains of the monumental Mesopotamian towers from which Babel was assembled?